Hi guys, it's Mr. Gonzalez again, here with Lesson 5, Ledger Lines. The main objective of this lesson is to be able to identify the notes above the treble clef staff and below the bass clef staff. Let's get going. More than one ledger line may be added to extend the lower and upper ranges of the grand staff. The next higher notes of the treble staff are G, A, B, and C. If we look here, and if you remember that this top line is F, we just continue on with the alphabet. So we have G, and then one ledger line up, we have A. Sitting on top of that ledger line is B, and then on the second ledger line, we have C. Here we can see the relation on the piano to middle C. Again, we have two C's, but this C will sound much higher than the middle C that we learned in the last lesson. The next lower notes of the bass staff are F, E, D, and C. Let's take a look. Our first line of the bass staff is G, so the letter before G is F. Then, if you come down again, the letter before F is E, and it sits on a ledger line. Come down one more step, we have D below the ledger line, and then sitting two ledger lines below the bass staff, we have another C. Here is the relationship between these four lower ledger line notes and middle C. Here are all the notes on the grand staff from bass clef low C to treble clef high C. Let's take a look at some exercises. For our first exercise, I have already drawn a treble clef for us. Now, we must name the notes. For our first note, we see a note below the treble clef staff with a ledger line through it. We know if it's below the staff with a line through it, we have a C. Next, up here, we just learned about this. So, we have a note above the staff and above the first ledger line. If you remember, the note sitting right on top of the staff is G, the note that sits on the line is A, and then the note above the line is B. This is B. Coming back down here, we see a note below the treble clef staff underneath the first ledger line. If that first ledger line is C, this comes before C, so this is B. For our next note, we see a note sitting right on top of the treble clef staff. It's sitting right above this fifth line. This fifth line is F, so if you go one letter above F, you have G. This is G. Down here, we see a note below the treble clef staff with no line attached to it. If there's no line attached to it, we have D. Here we have a note two ledger lines above the treble clef staff. If the first one is A and the in-between is B, if we go one up from B, we have C. Lastly, we have a note on the ledger line above the treble clef staff. So, if you know that this space in between the first ledger line and the top line of the staff is G, and you go up one, this note will be A. For our next exercise, I have already written the bass clef for us. Now, let's name the notes. For our first note, we have a note below the bass clef, but with no line attached to it. We know that this is an F. Coming up, we see a note on the first ledger line above the bass clef. If the note is on the line above the bass clef, it's a C. This is a C. Coming down again, we see a note below the first ledger line below the bass clef staff. So, if we know that this is an F, the line is an E, one below E is D. This is a D. Coming up again, we see a note above the last line of the bass clef. So if it sits above the last line, or the top line, we know that this is a B. Coming down again, we see a note below the bass clef staff on the first ledger line. This is an E. Coming up one last time, we see a note above the bass clef and above the first ledger line. That first ledger line is C, so if we go one above C, we have D. And lastly, coming down here, we see a note 2 ledger lines below the bass clef. If we know that this first one right here is F, the first ledger line is E, the next below that first ledger line is D, then we can figure out that 2 ledger lines below the bass clef staff we have C. For our last exercise, we are going to write each of the indicated notes in 4 places on the grand staff. Let's go. We're going to work clef by clef. Let's get started by adding one of each note. First, let's put a C. We know we have a C below the staff on the second ledger line. Next, let's add a D. We know the middle line is D. Let's add an E. We have an E right here above D. F, let's change it up. We can put an F here, but right now, let's come on down and put an F right here below the staff. Next we have G. We'll put our G on the first line. A will come, we have an A here, but for right now, we'll put our A all the way up top. Then lastly, we have B. I'll put our B above the bass clef, but not on a ledger line. Now that we have one placed, let's place a second. So we have 2 options for C. We have a C here on the second space. We also have a C above the clef on the first ledger line. We'll go with that. Next, we need a D. So we know that we have a D above the first ledger line, and we know we have a D below the first ledger line. We'll go with this one. Next, we need a second E. Well, we know there's only one other place that we know right now that's an E, and that is the first ledger line below the bass clef. Here, we need another F, and we know by looking at the bass clef, in between the 2 dots, it's showing us where F is. So we have an F here on the 4th line. Next, we need G. If you remember all cows eat grass, then you know that the 4th space is G. Next, we need an A. And we can use all cows eat grass again for our spaces. So we have an A here. Coming over here, we need B. We can use our good boys do fine always to help us out. And we can know that we have a B right there on the second line. Let's move to the treble clef. We'll place one of each note first, and then we'll come back with our second note later. We need a C. Let's put a C on the 3rd space. We can use face to help us out with that. So we have F, A, C, and E. Next we need D. We will use the D below the treble clef staff. Just hangs out right there with no ledger line. Now we need E. If you remember, every good boy does fine. We have an E right next to that D on the first line. Next we need F. We have an F here, but let's go with our other F. So if we use every good boy does fine for our lines, we have an F on top. Next we have G. We can use our G right here on the second line. Next we have A. We'll keep it simple and we'll move up to the second space for our A. Then last we have B. Let's go down a little bit this time. We know that our first ledger line below the treble clef is C, so if we go one below that, we have B. Let's come in with our last notes. So we need one more C. I don't want to use the C below the treble clef because we already have that same sounding C in the bass clef. So we can use the C that is 2 ledger lines above the treble clef. Next we need D. We know that every good boy does fine can help us out, so on our fourth line we can put D. Next we need an E. If we use face, F-A-C-E, for our spaces, we can find an E on the top space. Next we need an F. We know by using face we can find an F on our first space. Next we have G. Well, we already have this G, and we don't have a G below her right now. But we do know that there is a G that sits above the treble clef. Next we have A. Again, we don't have an A lower right now, but we do know on the first ledger line above the treble clef we have A. Then lastly, B. We know that every good boy does fine can help us with that with our line sentence. So we can put a B on our third line. That's it for today's lesson, guys. I hope you feel more confident in your ability to identify the ledger line notes above the treble clef and below the bass clef. In our next lesson, we will go over note values.